Hello and welcome to today's online intelligence briefing on the Gulf defence market. My name is Charles Forrester and I am the Jane's Principal Analyst for Manned Air and Aero Engines, and joining me today will be Principal Defence Budget Analyst Vanella McGurty. That concludes the introduction, but just before we begin, I'd like to highlight that the information used to compile today's presentation has been drawn from a variety of Jane's content, but particularly the Defence Industry and Markets Intelligence Centre. So to begin with, we'll look at some of the broader security challenges that the Gulf countries face. So in a broader context, the broader security challenges in the Gulf that they face. Well, going from the north, the potential threat from militancy overspill and instability in Iraq and Syria has now widely disappeared, although longer-running instability in Iraq may be a cause for concern, particularly Iranian influence in the country's political and security structures. At present, the southern and eastern boundaries represent the largest security threat to the countries of the Gulf, particularly as the war in Yemen is continuing. The conflict there has continued to be a considerable challenge for the countries involved. Particularly, there's been a lack of engagement from the Houthis in seeking a political solution to the conflict, and an increasingly vocal opposition from Western allies over the conduct of the war and the consequences of operations. There is now an element of the conflict potentially scaling down as the UAE has pulled out its forces from the area of operations, although political disagreements between the UAE-backed groups and the Hadi government could lead to a split in the country. Such a north-south split is not without precedent, with the country only being unified in 1990. However, at the time of recording, this situation is still changing, and policy may have altered in the meantime by the time you listen to this recording. The war in Yemen, beyond the political side, presents a number of serious issues for the Gulf states, as it has been one of the most involved conflicts that countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been involved in. From an operational perspective, this has meant the deployment of land, sea, and air forces into austere environments using their own support and projection capability. The operations tempo has been high, and some of the fighting on the ground particularly fierce and intense. As a result, equipment has faced some significant maintenance requirements, particularly as it has been deployed for extended periods of time and faced an increasingly capable opponent. The war in Yemen has also created a home front threat that is not inconsiderable. Again, looking at the historical missile threat focus, this has shifted from Saddam's Iraq in the north to Iran, and now to the southern front as launch sites track in from Yemen. The threat from the south has been particularly active and involved long-range artillery rockets and missiles, as well as unmanned aerial vehicles targeting urban centres and critical national infrastructure sites of importance. The advanced threat has become relatively persistent and required advanced response in the form of robust air and missile defence systems in Saudi Arabia, as well as soft-kill counter-UAV systems. At a tactical level, Houthi suicide UAVs have been used in Yemen against UAE forces, notably in an attack in January that killed 6 and wounded a number of other personnel. The maritime domain has also been an area that has experienced unmanned attacks in recent years, with unmanned surface vessels or drones being used to strike naval and commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Moving on to the Iranian threat more particularly, this has taken on an added sense of immediacy in recent months following the US withdrawal from the JCPOA in May last year. The ratcheting up of tensions has come as Iranian missile developments have continued apace, and the country has continued to be increasingly involved in supporting the Houthis in Yemen with advanced technology and training. The threat of confrontation with Iran has increased since June this year, when the IRGC was shown by the US military to have attempted to mine 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman, and the subsequent downing of a US Navy RQ-4A Global Hawk caused heightened tensions in the area. Since then, there have also been disputes with the UK and UAE over seized tankers, and a wider variety of foreign actors have since become involved in patrolling and securing the areas of transit. With the internationalization of the standoff, regional actors are having to work to find areas and methods that address their own political and security agendas while maintaining a degree of coherence with foreign allies and their approach to the confrontation.
So you can see that even though government spending dipped dramatically in 2015 and 2016, defence spending was more or less ring-fenced or protected. It flattened out over the period, but growth did return from 2017. Primarily that's down to increases in Saudi Arabia, which dominates regional spending, but we also saw increases in Kuwait, Qatar and UAE. with drivers spread across personnel, operational, and investment requirements. Despite these drivers, we did expect that the strong 6% growth in 2018 would prove unsustainable, and the increase did fall to a still respectable 4% this year. Again, this is due to the slowdown in Saudi Arabian spending, but as growth in the country picks up, we could see regional growth rates of about 3% a year from about 2022. This forecast assumes no significant increases in the oil price in the short term. If that were to happen, we would see further growth, or at the very least, more procurement activity in the region. So this chart summarizes the trend for 2019. On the vertical axis, we see growth in 2019, and the levels of spending are on the horizontal axis. Saudi is the standout country with high budget, growth-wise disappointing though this year. The three countries in the top left quadrant are key to market prospects too though. All grew at 4% plus this year, and there are signs that we'll see further increases from Qatar and UAE. On the less positive side, we saw cuts continue in Bahrain and Oman, and we're not expecting to see much of an improvement in the short term. This is to illustrate the difference between last year's stellar growth and this year's less impressive stats. Clearly, the drop in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain is evident, but the top left quadrant is still key. Growth has been sustained and consistent over the last 2 years in these countries, and that further emphasizes the importance and attractiveness of these markets, particularly the UAE with its larger defence and investment budget. So is the GCC alone in this slowdown in 2019? And the short answer is no. The top chart simply shows the GCC states' growth rates in a different way, making it clear that the majority of countries saw growth slow this year. So the overall growth dropped from 6% to 1.6%. And that's really reflected across the regions, including Middle East, North Africa as a whole, North America, Africa, and even Asia. Europe and Latin America were the only regions continuing to post growth. Europe especially experienced really strong growth in 2019, with 4% growth in the west of Europe and about 9% in the east. However, their market just isn't big enough to influence global trends, and the lower growth in North America has influenced the overall global trend. But really that's just spending being maintained at the exceptionally higher level of 2018, rather than any stagnation or cuts. So back to the GCC, in terms of drivers, there are some clear signs that defence is being prioritised. Defence budgets are rising as a percentage of GDP, but more importantly, they're also rising as a share of government spending, which is really a more accurate indicator of government priorities. The average share of state spending dedicated to defence rose from 13.4% in 2012 to 17% in 2017. It's since moderated to about 16%, but that's still significant if you think that, in contrast, European states tend to allocate just 6% of government spending to defence, so it's still a significant proportion of government expenditure. So while the rise in the GCC share is primarily the result of the security situation in the Middle East, we are also seeing GCC states adopt a more proactive stance to regional security. And in order to adopt that stance, we've seen national service introduced in a number of countries over the last 3 or 4 years, and efforts to improve readiness and training and the emergence of new capability requirements, all of which have prompted higher levels of spending. These changes in the short term are really driving increases in spending, but they are long-term in nature. So while some of the procurement cycles we're seeing might prove unsustainable, these changes to force structure and posture will require higher defence spending going forward. Looking into these procurement cycles, these two charts look specifically at defence contracts signed by the Gulf states since 2014. On the left, we have the value of contracts by country, and on the right, we have a comparison between the value of those contracts and the size of each country's core defence budget. So on the left, the thing that immediately stands out is that we've seen well over $100 billion in contracts finalised since 2014, despite the recent fiscal constraints. What also stands out is that Qatar has been by far the largest spender with almost half of the total, and that goes against trends in the previous 4 years. On the right, we're looking at it from the perspective of sustainability, and the scale of Qatar's investment is clear. Essentially, they have spent twice as much on equipment over the last 4 years than they would normally spend on total defence over the period. So that points not only to the fact that spending is unsustainable, but also that investment on this scale is aimed at an expansion of existing capabilities.
So this concludes the seminar. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I hope you'll be able to join us for the future briefing. Our next briefing will focus on Iran, and it's titled Back to the Future. Thank you and goodbye.